From my experience, shadows are the thing that photo manipulators find most hard to do. But don't worry. Understanding shadows means understanding light. And since we already know a lot about light, adding what we'll be learning in this section to our arsenal will help us paint shadows with ease. So what are shadows? Shadows are dark shapes that are created when an object blocks the light. They are always opposite to the light source. Shadows can be either form shadows or cast shadows. Form shadows are shadows that we find on the object itself. Cast shadows are the shadows that we see on a surface. These are created when an object blocks the light, casting a shadow in the opposite direction of the light source. There are several things that we need to consider when painting shadows. These are: 1. The type of light. Is the light hard or soft? As mentioned in Lesson 1, if the light source is smaller than the object, the shadow should be hard. On the other hand, when the light source is larger than the object, the shadow should be soft. Remember that this is also affected by the distance between the light source and the object. 2. Shadow shape. The shape of a shadow depends on the light position, the shape of the object, and also the viewer's position. We'll talk about these in detail throughout this lesson. Look at this cuboid. Notice how the outline of its shadow is sharper when it's closer to the object, and it's softer when it's farther away. Also, the shadow close to the object is dark, and it starts getting lighter as it gets farther away from the object. As explained in Lesson 3, the tighter the space, the darker the shadow. And we can see that the shadow is darkest where the object is closer to the ground. This happens because it's less likely for ambient light to reach such tight areas. 3. Shadow direction. Shadow direction is also fundamental. We mentioned that shadows are always opposite to the light source. But this does not mean that if the light is, say, coming from the left, all shadows of all objects are painted at the same angle. The angle of the different shadows would vary based on the position of the light source in relation to the object, and the overall image perspective, as we can see with these two blocks. If we want to be precise when doing this, we need to draw lines from the light source, past the object, touching the object's edges. Doing this will help achieve a realistic-looking shadow, at least from a direction point of view. This is more difficult to apply when you have 2D objects, as you cannot know the exact depth. That's where we need to refer to how these things look in real life and estimate their depth. When in doubt, I look for references on the internet to ensure that my shadows are as realistic as possible. 4. Object position. Shadows can tell us a lot about what's going on in a scene. Let's look at this sphere that is sitting on the ground. We see it has quite a dark shadow, and it gets darker the closer to the object. Now, let's look at a floating sphere. The farther the sphere is from the ground, the lighter and softer the shadow becomes. 5. Shadow size. Although many artists are a bit intimidated by this, estimating the shadow size is much easier than one might think. To roughly estimate the shadow size, we simply need to draw a straight vertical line from the light source down to the ground. Then, draw a horizontal line from where the vertical line touches the ground, past the object. And finally, draw a diagonal from the light source, touching the top of the object down to the ground. This point where these two lines meet is the size of the shadow. If the light is above an object which is not touching the ground, we need to find the size of the shadow in a different way. Looking at our diagram here, we can see that the farther the light source is from the object, the smaller the shadow becomes. And to estimate this, we need to draw lines from the light source, touching the object's edges. The point where the lines hit the ground is the width of the shadow. Something else to keep in mind is that when we move the object up from the ground, the shadow size also becomes bigger. That's because the object is closer to the light source, and if we draw our lines, we can see that the shadow is bigger. 6. Ambient light. As mentioned in Lesson 3, ambient light plays a vital role when it comes to shadows. We always need to consider how light bounces and how that affects our shadows. Remember, without ambient light, shadows would look solid and flat. Ambient light makes shadows look like a gradient. The tighter the space, the darker the shadow becomes. It's crucial to keep in mind that we are always mimicking how dark or light a shadow would look in real life. For example, if ambient light bounces off a white wall, most of it reflects back because white is the most reflective color. The result is light shadows. On the other hand, if light bounces off a dark wall, less of it reflects back. This is because black is the least reflective color, and therefore the shadows would be darker. If this sounds a bit complicated, don't worry, I will show you what I mean soon. And finally, 7. The contact shadow. As explained in Lesson 3, the contact area, where the object is touching the surface, gets the least amount of reflected light, making it the darkest part of the shadow. Many times I come across artworks with correct shadows, but sadly the contact shadow is missing. It's vital to remember to always include the contact shadow. There are only a few exceptions where we don't want to add contact shadows. For example, when we have flying, hovering, or bouncing objects. Or when there is light coming out of the ground.